What if I told you that for centuries, medieval women possessed a secret power that the church and nobles desperately tried to hide? That there existed an unwritten code passed down from mother to daughter, which allowed women to choose their own romantic destinies, even in an era where marriages were political transactions. Prepare yourself to discover the most forbidden truth of the Middle Ages, how women circumvented the feudal system and wielded a form of power that challenged the entire established order. Behind castle walls, far from the eyes of official chroniclers, a completely different reality unfolded from the one we've been told. In this video, you'll uncover the secret methods, hidden codes, and psychological strategies that medieval women developed to conquer not just hearts, but control over their own lives. A revelation that will forever change your perspective on the feminine role in history. Picture this. While history books painted medieval women as helpless pawns in their fathers' and husbands' games, something extraordinary was happening behind closed doors. A sophisticated system of communication existed that allowed women to express desires, make choices, and influence outcomes in ways that would shock anyone who believed the official story. This wasn't just wishful thinking or romantic fantasy. Archaeological evidence from personal letters, diary fragments, and even castle architecture reveals a hidden world where women developed their own language of power. They used symbols, gestures, and coded messages that flew completely under the radar of male authorities. The foundation of this system lay in what we might call emotional intelligence today. While men focused on warfare, politics, and land acquisition, women became masters of reading people, understanding motivations, and predicting behavior. They turned what society saw as their weakness into their greatest strength. Within the confines of castles and manor houses, older women taught younger ones the art of observation. They learned to read facial expressions, decode tone of voice, and interpret body language with surgical precision. This knowledge became their currency, their weapon, and their path to freedom. The key to understanding this phenomenon lies in recognizing that medieval women operated in a parallel universe of social interaction. While men conducted business in great halls and battlefields, women created their own networks in gardens, chapels, and private chambers. These spaces became laboratories for developing psychological strategies that would make modern negotiators jealous. They discovered early on that direct confrontation rarely worked in their favor. Instead, they perfected the art of subtle influence. A well-timed tear, a strategic silence, or a carefully chosen word could accomplish more than any sword or decree. They learned that emotions, when properly channeled, were far more powerful than logic or force. The most brilliant aspect of their approach was how they turned society's expectations against itself. Since women were expected to be emotional, they used emotions as tools. Since they were supposed to be submissive, they weaponized submission. Since they were considered intellectually inferior, they let others underestimate them while quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. Religious gatherings became particularly important venues for this hidden communication. During long church services, women developed elaborate systems of meaningful glances, subtle hand movements, and strategic positioning that allowed them to share information and coordinate plans without uttering a single word. The domestic sphere, which men dismissed as trivial, became the command center for these operations. In kitchens, women gathered intelligence from servants who had access to male conversations. In sewing circles, they analyzed the political landscape and planned their moves. During childbirth and recovery periods, experienced women passed down wisdom that had nothing to do with babies and everything to do with power. What made their system particularly effective was its invisibility. Men, focused on their own pursuits, rarely paid attention to what they considered feminine chatter. They failed to realize that behind every casual conversation about household management or children's education lay sophisticated discussions about influence, alliance building, and strategic positioning. The psychological insight that drove their success was profound. They understood that lasting power comes not from force, but from making others want to give you what you desire. They became experts at creating scenarios where men felt like they were making independent decisions, while actually following carefully planted suggestions. This foundation of secret communication and psychological mastery set the stage for something even more remarkable. Once women established their covert networks and honed their skills of influence, they were ready to tackle the most challenging aspect of medieval life, navigating the complex world of romantic relationships while maintaining some control over their own destinies. Building on their mastery of secret communication, medieval women transformed the entire concept of courtly love into something far more sophisticated than poets and troubadours ever imagined. What appeared to be romantic entertainment was actually a carefully constructed system that allowed women to evaluate, test, and ultimately choose their preferred partners within the constraints of arranged marriages. The genius lay in how they hijacked the very system designed to control them. Courtly love, originally conceived by men as a way to channel aggressive impulses into socially acceptable behavior, became a testing ground where women could observe potential suitors under controlled conditions. They turned romantic poetry, tournaments, and social gatherings into elaborate job interviews for the position of husband. Through seemingly innocent interactions, women gathered crucial intelligence about the men in their social circles. They watched how these men treated servants, how they handled frustration, whether they kept their word in small matters, and most importantly, whether they could be influenced through emotional appeal rather than mere authority. The language of flowers, ribbons, and symbolic gifts that characterized courtly love wasn't just decorative nonsense. It was a sophisticated communication system that allowed women to send complex messages about their preferences, concerns, and conditions. A rose given with thorns intact might signal interest, but with warnings. A particular color combination could indicate approval or rejection of a proposed arrangement. What truly revolutionized their approach was the realization that they could create emotional bonds with men before marriage negotiations were finalized. By the time fathers and political allies sat down to discuss terms, the men involved often had strong preferences based on emotional connections that women had carefully cultivated. The practice of granting favors became an intricate dance of reward and withdrawal that shaped male behavior in profound ways. Women learned to recognize which men responded to encouragement, which ones needed challenge, and which ones could be motivated through competitive instincts. They became behavioral psychologists centuries before the field officially existed. Religious festivals and seasonal celebrations provided perfect opportunities for this social experimentation. During these events, normal social barriers relaxed slightly, allowing for conversations and interactions that would be impossible under regular circumstances. Women used these windows to conduct their evaluations and plant the seeds of future influence. The concept of chivalry, while imposed by male social structures, became a tool that women could wield to their advantage. They learned to recognize genuine courtesy from mere performance, and they rewarded authenticity while subtly punishing fake behavior. Over time, this feedback system actually shaped how men behaved, creating a generation of nobles who were more responsive to female preferences than their predecessors. Perhaps most importantly, women discovered that they could create competition among suitors without appearing to violate social norms. By showing measured interest in multiple men simultaneously, they could observe how each one responded to rivalry. Some became more attentive, others more generous, and a few revealed ugly character traits that disqualified them from consideration. The psychological sophistication of their approach extended to understanding male pride and ego. They learned that men were more likely to pursue relationships they perceived as challenging to obtain, while losing interest in those that seemed too easy. This insight allowed them to create desire while maintaining dignity and social acceptability. Letter writing, when it was permitted, became another avenue for influence. Women developed skills in crafting messages that seemed properly submissive on the surface, while actually containing subtle negotiations about future arrangements. They learned to embed conditions and expectations within expressions of admiration and respect. The most remarkable aspect of their strategy was how they managed to maintain plausible deniability throughout the entire process. If confronted about their activities, they could always claim to be following social expectations and honoring traditions. Their methods were so subtle that even when they succeeded in influencing outcomes, observers might attribute results to luck or divine intervention rather than strategic planning. This mastery of romantic manipulation prepared them for the next phase of their hidden power, learning to operate effectively within the formal structures of medieval society while secretly controlling many of the outcomes that affected their lives. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the SIM Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. With their networks established and romantic strategies refined, medieval women moved into their most dangerous territory, wielding actual political influence while maintaining the facade of feminine helplessness. This required a level of psychological sophistication that would impress modern power brokers, all while operating in a world that officially denied them any authority whatsoever. The brilliance of their approach lay in understanding a fundamental truth about human nature. People reveal their real thoughts and plans when they believe they're talking to someone who poses no threat. Women became invisible repositories of sensitive information simply because men underestimated their ability to understand or use what they heard. Castle life provided perfect conditions for this intelligence gathering. Women moved freely through spaces where important conversations took place. They were present during meals when wine loosened tongues, in halls where messengers delivered reports, and in private chambers where allies plotted strategies. Their supposed invisibility became their greatest asset. The domestic responsibilities that society imposed on women actually gave them unprecedented access to information networks. Managing household staff meant controlling the people who cleaned chambers where secret meetings occurred, who served wine during sensitive negotiations, and who carried messages between different parts of the castle. Every servant became a potential source of intelligence. They learned to ask questions that seemed innocent, but gathered crucial information about political alliances, financial situations, and military plans. A casual inquiry about provisions might reveal details about expected siege duration. Questions about guest accommodations could uncover information about secret diplomatic visits. Concerns about household budgets might expose financial weaknesses that could be exploited later. The psychology behind their success involved understanding male ego and social dynamics. Men enjoyed explaining things to women, especially when they believed they were demonstrating superior knowledge. Women learned to ask the right questions in the right tone to trigger these explanatory responses, gathering valuable intelligence while making men feel important and clever. Religious activities provided another avenue for influence. Women who demonstrated exceptional piety gained access to confession booths, private audiences with clergy, and religious ceremonies where political figures let their guard down. They discovered that men often revealed more during spiritual moments than they would in any secular setting. The art of managing information became as important as gathering it. Women learned to control what they revealed, when they revealed it, and to whom. They became masters of strategic disclosure, using partial information to create alliances, prevent conflicts, or manipulate outcomes in their favor. Knowledge became their currency in a world that denied them economic power. Perhaps most remarkably, they learned to influence decisions without appearing to participate in decision-making processes. Through careful timing and strategic suggestions, they could plant ideas that men would later claim as their own insights. They discovered that people were more committed to ideas they believed they had conceived independently. The technique of indirect influence required extraordinary patience and psychological insight. Instead of directly opposing unwanted decisions, they learned to create conditions where those decisions would naturally fail or become unappealing. They might arrange for inconvenient information to surface at crucial moments, or ensure that supporters of opposing viewpoints had opportunities to present their cases more effectively. Family relationships became powerful tools for extending influence beyond their immediate households. Marriages, which were supposed to subordinate women to male authority, actually created networks of female allies across different territories and political factions. Sisters, daughters, and mothers-in-law could coordinate activities across vast geographic areas. The economic aspects of castle management gave women control over resources that could be used to build loyalty and create obligations. They learned to distribute favors, grants, and opportunities in ways that created networks of people who owed their positions to female patronage, even when that patronage remained officially invisible. Crisis situations revealed the full extent of their hidden power. During wars, political upheavals, or family emergencies, the formal structures of male authority often broke down, and the informal networks that women had built became the actual decision-making systems. In these moments, their true capabilities became briefly visible before disappearing again behind veils of proper feminine behavior. The psychological toll of maintaining this double existence was enormous, but the alternative was complete powerlessness. They learned to compartmentalize their public and private selves, presenting appropriate facades while privately pursuing their actual goals. This emotional discipline became another source of their effectiveness. Their success in wielding invisible political power set the stage for something even more audacious, developing techniques of personal influence that could shape the behavior and preferences of the men around them, creating an entirely parallel system of power that operated through attraction, manipulation, and emotional control. Moving beyond political maneuvering, medieval women developed what could only be described as psychological warfare, disguised as feminine charm. These weren't the crude seduction techniques that popular culture might suggest, but sophisticated methods of behavioral modification that operated on levels so subtle that their targets rarely realized they were being influenced at all. The foundation of their approach rested on a deep understanding of male psychology that would make modern researchers envious. They recognized that men's deepest vulnerabilities lay not in their obvious desires, but in their need to feel powerful, intelligent, and necessary. Women learned to create situations where satisfying these psychological needs coincided with granting female preferences. The timing of interactions became an art form in itself. Women discovered that men were most susceptible to influence during specific emotional states, after victories when they felt generous, during periods of uncertainty when they craved reassurance, or in moments of physical discomfort when they appreciated care and attention. They became experts at recognizing and capitalizing on these psychological windows. Physical appearance, while important, was just the surface layer of their strategy. The real power lay in creating emotional experiences that men would associate with their presence. They learned to be sources of comfort during stress, voices of encouragement during doubt, and islands of peace during chaos. This emotional conditioning created dependencies that were far more powerful than mere physical attraction. The concept of mystery became a central tool in their arsenal. Rather than revealing everything about themselves immediately, they learned to maintain an aura of incomplete knowledge that kept men curious and engaged. They understood that people value most highly what they have to work to obtain, and they applied this principle to every aspect of their interactions. Conversation became a carefully orchestrated performance where every word served multiple purposes. They learned to ask questions that made men feel important while gathering useful information, to offer opinions that seemed deferential while actually guiding thought processes, and to express emotions that appeared spontaneous while actually serving strategic goals. The psychological technique of intermittent reinforcement, though they wouldn't have known it by that name, became central to their approach. They discovered that irregular patterns of attention and withdrawal created stronger emotional bonds than consistent behavior. A smile that appeared randomly was more powerful than one that could be predicted and expected. They mastered the art of making men believe that female cooperation was voluntary rather than obligatory. Instead of merely complying with demands, they learned to create scenarios where men felt they were earning female approval through their own merit. This transformation of obligation into apparent choice made relationships feel more satisfying to male participants. The domestic environment became a laboratory for behavioral conditioning. Through the management of food, comfort, atmosphere, and emotional climate, women learned to create associations between their presence and positive experiences. Men began to unconsciously seek their company not just for physical reasons, but because being around them simply felt better. Religious and moral frameworks were turned into tools of influence. Women learned to frame their desires in terms of spiritual growth, moral improvement, or divine will. This technique was particularly effective because it appealed to men's desire to see themselves as righteous while making resistance appear sinful or spiritually harmful. The power of suggestion became refined to an extraordinary degree. Rather than making direct requests, they learned to plant ideas through casual observations, hypothetical questions, or stories about other people's experiences. These indirect methods bypassed conscious resistance and allowed ideas to develop as if they were the man's own thoughts. They discovered that physical comfort and emotional security were more addictive than passion. While intense emotions might capture attention temporarily, the steady provision of peace, understanding, and acceptance created long-term dependencies that were much harder to break. Men found themselves unable to imagine life without these sources of emotional stability. The technique of strategic vulnerability allowed them to create protective instincts without appearing weak. By carefully revealing selected struggles or concerns, they could trigger male desires to provide solutions and support. This method transformed men from potential threats into invested allies who had emotional stakes in female well-being. Perhaps most importantly, they learned to make their influence feel natural and inevitable rather than manipulative. The most effective techniques were those that worked with existing male inclinations rather than against them, creating situations where men felt they were following their own desires while actually responding to carefully created conditions. This mastery of personal influence prepared them for their ultimate achievement, building networks of female cooperation that could coordinate activities across entire regions, creating a shadow power structure that operated parallel to official medieval hierarchies. Building upon their individual mastery of influence and psychological manipulation, medieval women created something unprecedented in human history. A continent-spanning network of female cooperation that operated entirely in the shadows of official power structures. This network became so sophisticated that it could coordinate activities across kingdoms, influence major political decisions, and protect its members from masculine authority, all while remaining completely invisible to male observers. The foundation of this network lay in the marriage system itself, which ironically became the vehicle for female liberation rather than oppression. When women married into different families, territories, and political factions, they didn't lose their original connections, but instead created bridges between previously separate spheres of influence. Each marriage became a new link in an expanding chain of female communication. Religious institutions served as the nervous system of this network. Convents, pilgrimage routes, and religious festivals provided legitimate reasons for women to travel, meet, and exchange information across vast distances. Abbesses, who wielded actual authority within their religious communities, became key nodes in this system, coordinating activities and providing safe havens for sensitive communications. The brilliance of their communication system lay in its integration with normal female activities. Embroidery patterns contained coded messages. Recipe exchanges included political intelligence. Letters about children's health carried information about military movements. Even fashion trends became vehicles for transmitting complex information across geographic boundaries. They developed a sophisticated system of mutual protection that operated through reputation management. When a member of the network faced threats from masculine authority, other women would begin subtle campaigns to undermine the credibility of the threatening males. Rumors about financial impropriety, questions about military competence, or whispers about moral failures could neutralize male aggression without any obvious connection to the women being protected. The economic aspects of their network were particularly ingenious. Women learned to coordinate their domestic purchasing power to reward merchants and craftsmen who served their interests while punishing those who didn't. They could make or break local businesses through collective action, creating economic incentives for male cooperation with female preferences. Information warfare became one of their most potent weapons. The network could rapidly spread or suppress information depending on their collective interests. Favorable stories about allied males could be amplified across multiple territories, while damaging information about enemies could be disseminated with devastating effectiveness. They controlled the medieval equivalent of social media. The psychological sophistication of their approach extended to long-term strategic planning. They began arranging marriages and alliances with an eye toward expanding network influence into new territories or consolidating power in existing ones. What appeared to be normal family negotiations were actually moves in a continent-wide game of strategic positioning. Crisis response capabilities demonstrated the true power of their network. During wars, political upheavals, or natural disasters, the female network often responded more quickly and effectively than official authorities. They could coordinate refugee movements, manage resource distribution, and maintain communication lines when formal systems collapsed. The education of young women became a crucial network function. Older members identified promising girls and ensured they received training not just in traditional feminine accomplishments, but in the subtle arts of influence, communication, and network participation. This educational system perpetuated their power structure across generations. They learned to manipulate male competition to their advantage on a massive scale. By coordinating information sharing across territories, they could ensure that conflicts between male authorities served female interests. They might encourage disputes that would weaken troublesome opponents while strengthening allies, all through careful information management. The religious dimensions of their network provided both moral authority and practical protection. Women who demonstrated exceptional piety gained influence that even male authorities hesitated to challenge directly. They used this religious credibility to legitimize network activities and protect members from accusations of improper behavior. Perhaps most remarkably, they managed to maintain network security through a combination of compartmentalization and misdirection. Most participants knew only their immediate connections, preventing any single arrest or interrogation from compromising the entire system. Meanwhile, their activities were so thoroughly disguised as normal feminine behavior that male observers rarely suspected any organized coordination. The success of their network created the foundation for their most lasting achievement, establishing systems of female power and influence that would persist long after the medieval period ended, creating precedents and techniques that would influence women's strategies for centuries to come. The ultimate triumph of medieval women wasn't just in the power they wielded during their lifetimes, but in how they managed to embed their influence so deeply into social, political, and cultural structures that their impact continued long after individual women died. They created a legacy that fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization, even though their contributions were systematically erased from official historical records. The most profound aspect of their legacy lay in how they transformed masculine behavior across entire generations. Through their collective influence techniques, they gradually shifted male attitudes toward women, relationships, and social responsibility. Men who had been shaped by female influence unconsciously passed these modified behaviors to their sons, creating cultural changes that rippled forward through time. Educational systems bore the hidden marks of female influence in ways that only became apparent centuries later. Women who managed household education priorities quietly emphasized emotional intelligence, interpersonal skills, and ethical behavior alongside traditional masculine pursuits like warfare and governance. These educational choices produced male leaders who were subtly different from their predecessors. The legal evolution that eventually led to expanded women's rights didn't happen in a vacuum. Medieval women had spent centuries identifying weak points in legal systems and finding ways to work around restrictive laws. Their accumulated innovations created precedents and established practices that later reformers could build upon, even when the original female contributions were forgotten. Religious practices and interpretations were profoundly shaped by female influence operating behind the scenes. Women who couldn't officially participate in theological discussions nonetheless influenced religious development through their relationships with male clergy, their management of religious education for children, and their coordination of lay religious activities. Many supposedly masculine religious innovations actually originated from female insights. The economic structures of medieval society were quietly revolutionized by female network activities. Their coordination of purchasing power, their influence over domestic resource allocation, and their informal banking systems through religious institutions created economic patterns that persisted long after the women who created them were gone. They established precedents for female economic participation that would become crucial during later historical periods. Cultural values around relationships, marriage, and family life were fundamentally altered by their influence techniques. The concept of romantic love, which had been largely absent from earlier medieval culture, became central to Western civilization, partly because women had spent centuries training men to value emotional connection and personal compatibility alongside political and economic considerations. The psychological sophistication they developed in managing male behavior created templates for interpersonal influence that transcended gender lines. Their techniques for motivation, persuasion, and behavior modification became embedded in social practices, educational methods, and even political strategies, though their feminine origins were systematically obscured. Perhaps most importantly, they established proof of concept for female power operating through alternative channels. Even when official authorities succeeded in suppressing obvious forms of female influence, the networks, techniques, and cultural changes they had created provided resources and inspiration for future generations of women facing similar challenges. The artistic and cultural movements that emerged during and after the medieval period bore the invisible fingerprints of female influence. Literary themes, architectural priorities, artistic subjects, and cultural values all reflected the gradual impact of centuries of female input operating through masculine channels. The Renaissance itself might not have been possible without the cultural groundwork laid by medieval women. Their influence on child-rearing practices created personality changes that accumulated across generations. Children raised under subtle female influence develop different emotional capacities, interpersonal skills, and social values than those raised in purely masculine environments. These personality differences eventually contributed to broader social transformations. The tragic irony of their legacy was how thoroughly their contributions were erased from historical memory. The very success of their invisibility techniques meant that later historians, working with official male-authored sources, found no traces of female influence in the developments they had actually orchestrated. Their greatest triumph became the source of their historical invisibility. Modern women dealing with similar challenges of operating in male-dominated environments unknowingly inherited many of the techniques, strategies, and cultural assumptions that medieval women had developed. The psychological insights, influence methods, and network-building approaches that seem natural to contemporary women often trace back to innovations developed by their medieval predecessors. The ultimate legacy of medieval women was proving that power doesn't always flow through official channels, that influence can be more effective than authority, and that determined individuals can create profound social changes even when working within severely restrictive systems. They demonstrated that historical progress often happens through accumulated small influences rather than dramatic public confrontations. Their story reminds us that official historical records capture only part of human experience, and that some of the most significant historical developments happened in spaces that official chroniclers never thought to examine. The forbidden secret of medieval women wasn't just how they chose their lords, but how they quietly reshaped an entire civilization while remaining invisible to the men who thought they ruled it. The next time you hear someone say that women throughout history were powerless victims of patriarchal oppression, remember the medieval ladies who turned their supposed weaknesses into weapons of unprecedented influence. They prove that true power isn't always visible, that the most profound changes often happen in whispers rather than shouts, and that underestimating someone based on their official status can be the greatest strategic mistake of all. Perhaps the real question isn't whether women had power in the past, but whether we've simply forgotten how to recognize it when it operates outside the traditional channels that history books prefer to document. Their legacy lives on in every woman who has ever smiled while getting exactly what she wanted, who has ever influenced a decision without appearing to participate in it, or who has ever built something lasting while letting others take the credit.